Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Lukman, and this is Brick by Brick. I apologize for being a little bit late this evening. For tonight's discussion, I have a lot of visual material for you because there's really no way to have a discussion about the rise of the political black left in America without starting from what isn't really the beginning of black struggle, because really the beginning of black struggle occurred during the 6 years or after the 6 years that Africans were free in the colonies. You heard me correctly. At the beginning, at the birth of this nation, as the colonies were established, there were Africans here with the original European immigrant settlers. And those Africans enjoyed freedom for only 6 years. So black struggle has been going on in this country before it was ever even a country. But if we really want to talk about the documented struggle, maybe that's not even correct. Because slavery lasted for 258 some odd years. That's a long period of time to cover to discuss the struggle of a people. So let's start off at what seems like a logical starting point for me, an easy starting point for you, somewhere where we can put a pin in a definitive point in history that we can all agree upon is almost what a lot of Americans think of as a clean slate in the history of the black existence in the United States, and that's the end of the Civil War. That period is commonly known as the Reconstruction, and it's the reconstruction of not just the physical infrastructure of much of the South and some northern territories in Western as well, but it's also the reconstruction of the unity of this country. And in establishing that reconstruction, there were efforts that were made, although they were not very they weren't very comprehensive, they weren't very well thought out, and they weren't very effective in a lot of ways, but there were efforts made on behalf of the newly unified government to make good on the promise of freedom to the newly emancipated former slaves. But as I said, that effort wasn't well thought out. It wasn't robustly supported by this government. And it certainly wasn't agreed upon by the former slaveholders. and the members of the former slavery-focused Southern society. So let's start with these slides as I tell you this story, some of the stories along the timeline of the rise of the political black left, because we can't get there unless we understand what black people have been struggling against since emancipation. So in 1865 is, as we know, the year that slavery officially ended in the United States. The government did try to help both formerly enslaved people and formerly slave-owning and slave-accepting Southern society to transition from the South being a slave society to an equal society. That was their idea. So the government, through the War Bureau, established the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. The Freedmen's Bureau's responsibilities included introducing a system of free labor. Now, this can't be missed. It wasn't the government's idea to get former slave owners to pay their former slaves to work. They wanted to institute a system of free labor, overseeing some 3,000 schools for free persons. So the government did move to address the lack of education that was legally enforced upon the enslaved. The Freedmen's Bureau was responsible for settling disputes between former slave masters and former overseers and the white slave-accepting members of society and the formerly enslaved. The Freedmen's Bureau was responsible for enforcing contracts between the landowners and their free black labor force. The labor force was still free. And securing justice for blacks in state courts, which was something that was non-existent before, remember, again, for over 250 years. The Bureau was renewed by a congressional bill in 1866, the following year, but it was vetoed by President Andrew Johnson, who thought it was unconstitutional. Because you see, Johnson was, let's not mince words, Johnson was a racist. Johnson was a slavery sympathizer and supporter, and he was opposed to having the federal government secure rights for black people. But Congress did pass the Freedmen's Bureau bill to renew the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866 over President Andrew Johnson's veto. Now, of course, as I said, this was not an easy transition, and this was partially badly managed by the government because they didn't consider how deeply entrenched slavery as an institutional part of Southern society was in the South, and also because I think some of those anti-black sentiments also existed among people in the North. I just told you that Andrew Jackson didn't want to enforce rights for black people. So the Freedmen's Bureau was really never given the authority and the power that it needed to carry out its mandate. Because simply put, under Andrew Jackson, the government didn't want them to. So Southern whites were basically very opposed to having any rights at all, to blacks having any rights at all. And the Bureau lacked the military force to back up its authority, since the Army had been disbanded after the war and most of the soldiers were assigned to the Western frontier, where they were beginning to slaughter Native Americans under President Andrew Jackson. The Bureau was able to accomplish some of its goals, like establishing schools and colleges. That's how Howard University and Hampton came into existence, through the Freedmen's Bureau. But for these successes, the Freedmen's Bureau didn't achieve all of its mandates. Partially, as I said, because General Howard believed that the mission of the Bureau was temporary at best. The Freedmen's Bureau was initially only going to be a 2-year effort. That's all the time the government planned to transition over 4 million formerly enslaved black people into a hostile society with no resources, no support, and really no apparatus to help them acclimate to a society they didn't know anything about themselves, because they'd always been enslaved. And of course, the attitude of racial animus towards black people, even if it's not overtly racist, the attitude that General Howard had, that he wanted to avoid black dependency on the federal agency, doesn't that sound familiar to you? Doesn't that sound exactly what many conservatives and many people who are even identifying themselves as liberals say about black people today when they talk about welfare? General Howard firmly believed that African Americans should obtain all their rights as quickly as possible. He absolutely did want black people to have all of the rights that they should have as American citizens, but even he failed to see the level of hostility that many Southern white people had, not just toward the North, because they lost the war, but also toward the newly emancipated former free and forced workforce that they now are being told they have to live equally side by side with. The Bureau's mandate was to bring whites and blacks together in the South, but it just lacked the means to do so. It needed support from Southern and Northern politicians, and they received little help from either. In 1869, the Freedmen's Bureau staff was cut short drastically, and it ceased operations in 1872. So during this time, you have massive amounts of violence, animus, hatred, racial hatred and violence that was directed toward black people who were trying to find their place, their footing, establish themselves in a society that had only wanted them there to serve that society as slaves. And because of the establishment of the Ku Klux Klan, the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 had to be passed by Congress. What were the Enforcement Acts? The Enforcement Acts were criminal codes that were passed by Congress to target mostly the acts of the Ku Klux Klan, but it wasn't only the Ku Klux Klan. It was also very sympathetic members of white Southern society and plenty of people in Northern society as well, who opposed blacks having the right to vote, holding office, or being educated. Because remember, for 250 plus years, black citizens, black people who weren't even citizens until the 14th Amendment was passed, but black people did not have the right to do any of these things for over 2.5 centuries. Many states were afraid to take strong action against the Klan, either because the political leaders sympathized with the Klan, and this was political leaders in the North and some in the South and some in the North as well, because political leaders were members of the Klan, again, in the South predominantly, but some in the North, or because some states were just too weak to act. The Klan, by the way, was established in 1866. Let me go back a couple of slides so you can see the significance of that date. The Freedmen's Bureau staff was drastically cut in 1869. The Civil War ended in 1865. The racial terror of the Ku Klux Klan began a year after a year after the Civil War ended, a year after the Emancipation Proclamation. So from the late 1860s up until the late 19th century, free blacks were subjected to racial terror on a scale that we don't learn about in school today. Not in elementary school, not in high school. Many of us don't even learn this history in college. What we learn is a little bit of what I just told you. The Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the Civil War. Some people might learn about the Freedmen's Bureau. Some people may learn about the 14th Amendment being ratified in 1868. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to the formerly enslaved in 1868, a year before the Freedmen's Bureau was basically, its powers were dwindled down, stripped away. What a lot of people learn in college is that the 14th Amendment, the purpose was supposed to ensure the civil liberties under the Constitution of the newly emancipated population of black citizens to establish their citizenship in the United States. A side note that I have to bring up about the 14th Amendment, remember in another series, I talked about the fact that even though the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to the formerly enslaved, it didn't grant citizenship to Native Americans. Then shortly after the 14th Amendment was passed, a lot of people in college learn about the 15th Amendment, which was passed, or ratified rather, in 1870. The 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote. And these were all efforts by the government to ensure that the newly emancipated African Americans had rights under the Constitution as citizens of the United States. But the Ku Klux Klan and the white racist sympathizers who, again, and I cannot stress this enough, people who were sympathizers of the Klan or just plain racists and did not want black people to have equality, let alone freedom, were not limited to people in the South. And while I understand that there is definitely a political party affiliation that people like to bring up all the time about this period of time, you see, it was the radical Republicans who pushed for emancipation, who pushed for the rights of the newly emancipated blacks. And it was the Southern Democrats who were the racist resistance to freedom and equality. That's absolutely true. The problem with holding on to that narrative in 2017 is that it ignores centuries of history in between this period of time during the Reconstruction and this period of time in 2017, where the Republican Party and the Democratic Party look very different from what they did back in the 19th century. Although, in some regards, maybe they're really not that different at all. But that's a discussion for another show. So let's talk about the Klan, shall we? Because we're in the midst of the aftermath of an horrific incident in Charlottesville, Virginia, where members of white nationalist, racist groups, the largest gathering of white nationalist, white supremacist, racist groups that has occurred in the 21st century in America, happened just this weekend in Charlottesville, North Carolina. And it is interesting, as I participate in some of the discussion about this incident and the significance of it, it's interesting to see people refer to the participants, the alt-right members of the rally, of the Unite the Right rally, who, I must give a small aside here, alt-right is a modern term for white supremacist. It does not mean ultra-conservative. It does not connote politically conservative ideology. The alt-right are white supremacists. They are white nationalists, and they are racists. The term alt-right was created to make people believe that those who subscribe to the alt-right ideology aren't racists because they're not using the term racist. That's how important words are. And that's how important history is. Because the imagery coming out of Charlottesville Friday night of white men and white women marching through the campus of the University of Virginia at night with torches. Many people said, and I even said, was reminiscent of the march of the Nazis, of the SS through Germany, through Jewish neighborhoods in Germany. But it's reminiscent of something that happened much earlier than Germany in 1933. That torch-lit march through the University of Virginia campus is reminiscent of the Ku Klux Klan midnight raids and rides on the homes of black people and their white allies and supporters and helpers, riding on horses in the middle of the night with torches held high, not just to burn crosses on people's lawns, but to burn people either out of their homes or to burn people alive in them. This all began to happen in the United States in 1866 with the establishment, the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, an organization that was created as a direct result of the effort to give freedom and equality, to ensure, rather, freedom and equality to the formerly enslaved black population. So from 1866 until very late in the 19th century, even after the passage of the 14th Amendment, and even after the passage of the 15th Amendment, and even after the passage of the Enforcement Acts by Congress, Black Americans faced racial terror at the hands of the Klan and regular old everyday white citizens who were angry that they had to live next to people who used to be considered less than human. And black people endured this racial terror, this racist terrorism, all throughout, not just the South, but throughout the country. It was concentrated in the South, in many, many race riots that were carried out by mobs of angry, racist white people, destroying not just property, but lives. This list is not exhaustive, and I must warn you because there are pictures that accompany this list. They are not graphic, but I can imagine that they will be disturbing for some people. So if this is a very sensitive topic for you, I am warning you that you might not want to continue with this discussion right now. Feel free to come back later when you can handle seeing the imagery with hearing the narration. But these acts of racist terrorism that were carried out by mobs of angry racist white people against black people who were merely trying to establish a life for themselves and their families in this country are just a portion of what we've endured. Incidences like in 1870 in Lawrence, South Carolina, a mob of 2,500 armed whites rioted against the local freedmen's militia, black office holders, and their white allies. In 1870 in Utah, Alabama, in political unrest, white mobs sparked riots at polling places to terrorize and intimidate black voters. In 1871, in Meridian, Mississippi, rioting white mobs killed 30 blacks over several days of rioting. Local black homes were burned down along with a black school. Here is a picture that was published in a newspaper in 1866 depicting a scene of the Memphis race riot. Now, I know some people may see these pictures and say, I did not know these things happened, and I did not know they were even documented. The idea that we don't know the history of racist terrorism in this country is a false one. These incidences, these events were recorded, many of them. A lot of them were not, but many of them were recorded and published in newspapers. Some of those newspaper clippings and pictures like this were kept as mementos along with the property of the victims of the riots and the violence, and even sometimes body parts. Here is another picture of the Memphis race riot of 1966. This picture depicts a mob of white men burning down a freedmen's school. In 1873 in Colfax, Louisiana, armed white mobs riot against black office holders, burning the courthouse with blacks inside, killing 60 to 150. They could never decide on how many people were really burned alive in the courthouse at Colfax, Louisiana. In 1874 in Vicksburg, Mississippi, white citizens angered by black voters and office holders erupt into a riot. 31 people were killed. In 1874 in Coushatta, Louisiana, paramilitary White League sparks riot, killing 20 freedmen, office holders, and their white allies. I think I definitely have to say here that the idea that black people do not know and do not appreciate the efforts and the sacrifices that white people who have fought with, for, and on our side, that the idea that we're not appreciative of the sacrifices of white allies and we are not aware that there are white people who have always been advocates, staunch advocates of equality and freedom for black people, that is ridiculous. We know there have always been white people who have been willing to sacrifice even their own lives to fight for our freedom and our equality as well. The issue is when we talk about the issue of racial inequality and racial injustice, we're not talking about those white people. We're talking about the white people who participated in events like this. The Colfax Massacre of 1873. This pictorial shows survivors of the massacre being expelled from Colfax, Louisiana, dragging the injured away, taking their families out of the town. And as I said, these incidences were reported in newspapers. Here is a newspaper clipping that calls this incident the War of the Races, as if this were an equal fight. The victims, the black victims of this racist terrorism, were defenseless and unarmed. And you can see in this newspaper clipping, they even estimate that nearly 300 black people were burned to death by whites in Louisiana. Now, of course, many of us, as I said, don't learn any of this in school. But to believe that no one descended from anyone who participated in these events passed the narrative of these horrible terrorist acts, down through their families, of course people talked about these horrible things that not only their families participated in, white families, but the black families who were survivors, who were victims. In 1874, the Liberty Place riot in Louisiana, 5,000 white League members riot against local government that was seen as favorable to blacks. 40 were killed. 40 blacks were killed. In 1876, in Hamburg, South Carolina, armed white mobs riot in a local black district, killing members of black militia and looting the town. At this point in the history of freedom for black people in the United States, we recognized that we needed to protect ourselves, so we formed militias to protect the communities we were trying to establish. But we were always outnumbered and always outgunned. In 1898, in Wilmington, North Carolina, a white mob of 2,000 attacks a black newspaper, rampaging and looting black districts, homes, businesses, churches, schools. 15 to 60 blacks were killed. And here's a picture of the Liberty Riot, a drawing rather, of the Liberty Riot of 1874. Here is a newspaper article about the Hamburg Massacre of 1876. These were not incidences that white society were ashamed of. They were published in local newspapers, accounts of these massacres, of these racist riots against black people in black communities, in black businesses, the destruction of black homes, schools, churches, the taking of black life by the tens of dozens, by the hundreds in cities across this country. These are not incidences that white Americans were ashamed of. This was just regular news to them. Our lives did not matter enough for many white people in society to be ashamed. Our terrorism and our death was like entertainment. Here is an actual photograph of some of the white mob that amassed and carried out the Wilmington Massacre in 1898. Do these people look like they're ashamed of what they're about to do? They pose proudly with their weapons, knowing that they are about to go and invade and terrorize, murder, and destroy what black people have built. Why? Because they did not want black people to have the same freedom and equality and equal access to society that they did. Here's another newspaper clipping, this time of the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. I have quite a few slides, so I have to move around quite a bit. So at this point in the history of freedom for Black people in the United States, many Black leaders are wondering what they can do to both help empower Black people, to help Black people establish a firm footing in a society that clearly does not want them, how they can navigate around that, and also how they can convince white people, quite literally, to stop killing Black people. That this is not an exaggeration. In 2017, when members of Black Lives Matter are in the streets marching and chanting, "Stop killing us," it is reminiscent of these racist, terrorist attacks against newly emancipated Black people that occurred in the 19th century, immediately after the end of the Civil War. Black leaders then were asking themselves, how do we get white people to stop killing us? We only want peace. We only want to be able to make a way for ourselves and our families, just like everyone else. One person had an idea that is still very controversial today. And it's controversial because the ramifications of that idea were a mixed bag. And we actually still deal with the ramifications of that idea in many ways today. And that person was Booker T. Washington. I have to find the picture. There we go. Booker T. Washington, of course, you're going to look him up, and I will provide you information on his background and who he is. But Booker T. Washington was probably most famous for the Atlanta Compromise. If you've seen my live streams anywhere else, you've seen me talk about the Atlanta Compromise and how problematic the Atlanta Compromise was. Most people don't know what the Atlanta Compromise was even about. Booker T. Washington wanted two things. He wanted to uplift his people from the poverty that they were really relegated to because they weren't allowed to work. They weren't being allowed equal access to opportunity in society. Whenever Black people established something, white people came along and destroyed it because they didn't want them to have it. And Black people were relegated to poverty. But Booker T. Washington also wanted to save the lives of his people. And he wanted to do that with white people's money, because they owed it. American society owed Black people that they emancipated after 2.5 centuries of free and forced labor that they were never compensated for. Booker T. Washington figured if white people wanted Black people to stay in their place, then white people should pay for it. So he came up with the Atlanta Compromise. And it is something that people in the Black community talk about, argue about, debate about, We can't quite always agree on whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, whether we respect Booker T. Washington, whether we excoriate him or not. The challenge that Booker T. Washington faced was winning the confidence of the white community so that they could give him the money that he needed to open Tuskegee Institute, to expand it. This is where Tuskegee Institute came from. This is the good part of the Atlanta Compromise. Washington knew that he wasn't going to get financial backing from a very hostile and a very racist white society by pushing black equality with white people. So he told this very hostile and very racist white society at a convention in Atlanta that his method of education for blacks would, quote, not be out of sympathy with agricultural life, end quote. Basically, his idea for educating black people was to continue to educate black people on how to do what they had been forced to do for the past 250 years, which was farm, mostly. Harvest. So on July 4th in 1881, Booker T. Washington officially opened Tuskegee with what he described as 30 anxious and earnest students, many of whom were already public school teachers. Washington was the only teacher. As word of the school spread, other teachers and students began to arrive, and all were mature men and women, and some were very elderly, actually. Washington's plan was to train most of his students to be teachers who would return to their rural communities, because remember, most black people still lived in the rural communities where they were recently on plantations. And he wanted to teach those people how to, quote, put new energy and new life into farming, end quote, and also to improve the moral, intellectual, and religious life of the people. With local white support behind him and his growing ability to secure loans and credit, Washington turned to constructing a new building that would enable him to carry out his goals. So here is the problematic part of Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise. His idea for securing funding to educate black people was not to educate black people in profession-focused skills like doctors and lawyers, nurses. His plan was to educate black people to be better farmers, because that was the position that white society was used to seeing black people in, the service positions, the vocations, the skilled trades, the laborers, carpenters, blacksmiths. This, of course, relegated black people, even though they were receiving an education, it continued to relegate black people to the labor status, the serving status in society. Yes, a higher socioeconomic status than they were immediately after slavery, but they could only go so far. because the only way he was going to get the money to expand Tuskegee was to ensure that black people were only educated to go so far. That's the only way white people who gave them the money would agree to giving him the money. They did not want black people to be educated as much as some of them were. And here is the key. Because we're not talking about just the wealthy, even though most of his money definitely came from landowners, but middle class and poor whites also did not want black people to be educated. So this was a part, excuse me, a part of Booker T. Washington's plan, and he introduced it at a speech that is quite infamous. The Atlanta Compromise was introduced in 1895 at a convention when Booker T. Washington came out of the stage. He wasn't announced. No one in the white audience, mostly white audience, knew that he was speaking. So this is the account that was published in a newspaper about Booker T. Washington's speech. It says, when among them a colored man appeared, a sudden chill fell on the whole assemblage. One after another asked, "What's that nigger doing on the stage?" But when Washington rose to speak and began by criticizing his people, black people, for seeking political and economic power during Reconstruction, the crowd suddenly became very attentive. Our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the productions of our hands, and fail to keep in our mind that we shall prosper as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor. It is at the bottom of life we should begin, and not the top. This is what Booker T. Washington said to an audience of mostly white. Definitely racist. Definitely hostile. Southerners. What described that came next was that Booker T. Washington held up his hand with his fingers splayed out. And he said, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the finger, yet one as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress." I absolutely have to go back to this portion of what Booker T. Washington said, because this is one of the things, one of the legacies that we continue to live with, that is a part of the stereotype that black people are accused of to this day. It didn't come from him. This stereotype of lazy black people who don't want to work is much older than the Atlanta Compromise and Booker T. Washington. But the fact that a black man used it in order to secure financing to educate black people, but only educate them so far, is ironic, isn't even the word. Our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the productions of our hands. We were supposed to, he was telling white people, live by skilled labor. That's what we were made for. This was what we were supposed to do. And another thing that he did that is very reminiscent of what black politicians do today. He criticized black people for seeking political and economic power. Criticizing black people for wanting too much power. For wanting more money than people think we should have. For wanting handouts is what people accuse us of wanting. Part of this is where that comes from. Again, that is older than Booker T. Washington as well. But the concept, the idea of a black leader pandering to the negative stereotypes of black people to appease white people is a part of the legacy of the Atlanta Compromise that we live with today, and that even black people who recognize the difficult situation that Booker T. Washington was in, even we struggle with his plan. Of course, today, Tuskegee Institute is a renowned university, historically black university. But it started out quite literally as a vocational school. But this was one of the things that Booker T. Washington felt he had to do. This was his idea to address the slaughter of black people, especially in the South. He was hoping that assuring white people who were hostile to the social, political, educational, and economic advancements of black people, he was hoping that if he could assure them that black people would not pursue political office, that they would not pursue economic gains beyond what they should pursue, then white people would let black people live and achieve in peace. That was the compromise. Do you want to guess what happened? Not too long after the Atlanta Compromise, the Supreme Court heard the case of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 and rendered a decision. Speaking for a 7-man majority, Justice Henry Brown wrote, quote, "A statute which implies merely a legal distinction between the white and the colored races has no tendency to destroy the legal equality of the two races. The object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law. But in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color, or to enforce social, as distinguished from political equality, or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either." Plessy v. Ferguson was a Supreme Court decision that established the separate but equal standard of racial discrimination in public accommodation in the United States. Plessy v. Ferguson was based on a case of a mulatto man who did not want to sit in the black section of a train car. And the decision to implement separate but equal was based largely on racial stereotypes of black people that even other black people, like what were called mulattoes then, we don't use that term now, that even mulattoes used to separate themselves from other black people. What was the stereotype? That black people smell bad. Yes, the case of Plessy v. Ferguson was decided partially based on the idea that someone did not want to have to be forced to sit next to a Negro because Negroes smell offensively. And it was unconstitutional for the court or anyone else to compel someone to be subjected to such an insult. These were the things, the legal hurdles, the social hurdles, the economic hurdles, the educational hurdles, the violence that newly emancipated black people had to contend with after the end of the Civil War, after the end of Reconstruction rather. These were some of the struggles that laid the foundation for organized black political resistance. Social resistance, absolutely. But Plessy v. Ferguson began to be challenged by black people almost from the day the decision was handed down. There has never been a 10-year period of time in this country in which black people have been in this country that we have not fought for our rights. There has never been a decade that black people have not had to fight for our rights. Next week, we'll continue with a discussion of the black political struggle in the 20th century, the beginning of the formal civil rights era, and beyond, as we try to understand the forces that created the rise of the political black left and why that resistance is so important today. I'll provide these slides for you with some additional information on the Facebook page and on the YouTube channel for your easy access. I'll also provide some supporting information for you so you can read some more information, some more in-depth information about so much more of this history that we simply don't have time to cover here in Brick by Brick. Thank you very, very much for joining me tonight. These are very difficult times we are in. But as you can see, we've been here before. We can get through this. We can build a better foundation for a better future, for a better country. But we have to tear down the misinformation, the half-truths, and the blatant lies brick by brick, and build that wall of truth up in its place. Thank you for watching. Share this video. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like and follow us on Facebook. My name is Jacqueline Lukman, and this has been Brick by Brick. Good night.
Building it brick by brick.